Hi, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Just a quick check if I'm audible. Can I get a hand raise? So yeah, welcome everybody to eGov's webinar on digital design system. I am Antriksh Kumar. I am a UX architect at eGov here. So today's session is on the digital design system. Probably we'll break this into the design system in general, where I'll talk about what is design system. Then we can go to digital design system, where we can explore the digital design system in detail. And then we'll talk about how we can customize and build on top of it. So let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible, guys? Yeah. Okay. So we can keep, we will, for any questions in between, just keep your questions with yourself. We will have a Q&A in the last of the session. Okay. So basically, what is a design system? A design system is a set of principles, methods, and tools that enable the consistent and rapid delivery of digital products and services. So basically, what does it mean is, whenever you are developing a product, it's always good to have a design system in place. It focuses on rapid delivery of services. Next slide is it? Yeah. Some other examples, which is very common layman language, how will you define a design system? I'm assuming that there are people from development in the audience. So I'll keep it more developer centric rather than a design centric. So a design system is like imagine this as like of Lego blocks, where you have different blocks and you can create n number of shapes and products from using those Lego blocks. A design system is always a synced library of components. When I say synced library, there's just two places you can store. One is in the design and one is in the code. And these always are in sync, so that it gives a single source of truth for everybody. Like everybody knows what your components are and your patterns are. Okay, so key principles of design system. Why do we need a design system? One is efficiency. So instead of when you are building a this product, the common problem which we face is we develop something, we define a component, a pattern, and next time if somebody new comes, he or she repeats the same thing. So why not document everything, break into components and patterns, and then instead of repeatedly building similar components from scratch, design systems you can have all these components and patterns defined so that everybody can come and just start building on top of it without the need of reinventing the wheel every time. What this leads is, it leads to reusable components and increasing efficiency. So you can develop at speed and scale. Next key principle of design system is consistency. So when you have a design system in place, your product will automatically become consistent. For example, you define a button, you define a text box, and you start defining these patterns. So more and more you define these patterns and components, there will be more consistency in your product, which leads to greater trust for end user who is using the product. Just for a example, if we are not using a design system, what can happen? Just for example, I will just take this new slide. So this is a audit which was done for an existing product, and you can see from there are n number of variations for each component. The search bar has n number of variations, which is used across products. There are too many variations for tabs. For the same component, we are using different variations. So this is what happens when we don't have a design system in place and we keep reinventing components and patterns again and again. So this leads to inconsistency across products, which therefore results to low trust among users who is using the product. Okay, scale. So when you have your components built and defined, you can make product at a very large scale and at a very fast pace, maintaining the efficiency and consistency. So when I say scale, it's for both designers and developers. Designers who are designing the products also can design screens and product at a very large scale and speed, because they have design components already there in the design files. And for the developers also the same thing. We have coded components defined and developed so that they can create pages and screens at a very high space and scale. Okay, so coming to the high level goals of design system. So in all the previous slides, I've walked you through the use case of design system. So what the high level goal a design system has to attain is, it has to ensure for faster prototyping with reusable patterns and components, so that you focus on user experience. So rather than wondering which what text field to use, which button to use, what to show when there's an error, everything is defined. We don't need to worry on these things. These things are defined. Design system gives you all these things in place, so that we focus more on the user experience part, on how the user journey will be, focusing on the bigger problems. Okay, again, with design system, you boost user confidence with our recognizable design patterns. So this usually happens in specifically in government products. We have seen, like, there are different modules, and each modules are developed by different vendors. So we have inconsistency in pattern. People paying for say, for example, a property tax will not get the same experience when they are paying for a trade license, because they are two independent modules developed by two different set of vendors. So by using a common design system, you ensure that you have consistency across your products, across your modules, so that end user also gets a self-confidence when she is using the product. Okay, accessibility. I will touch some aspect of accessibility. So design system makes sure that your products are accessible. When I say accessibility, it's also designing for the users. For example, say people who have low vision or people who can't see. So you have to design for those people also in mind. Indian government have certain guidelines, which I will walk you through when I go through the design system. There are certain guidelines which we have to follow, which will make sure that your products are accessible and passes a certain checklist. At a high level, these are a few things. For example, colors. How do you use colors? How to use the contrast on colors? There should be an alternate text or for images. There has to be a navigation. Speech to text should be there on your web pages. I will cover all these things in details when I come to the design system demo. So a design system should ensure that your products, your components are accessible enough. Okay, so what does a design system contains? A design system will contain a design language, a design kit, component library, a developer sandbox, and documentation. Design language is basically telling what is the design personality of the product, where you define the foundations like colors, typography, shadows, spacing. Design kit is a design file. Probably it will be in Figma or Sketch, maintained by the design team, where other designers can also use and start designing on top of it. Component library are focused for developers. We have the same coded components available for developers, which are maintained in a separate library. Then we have a developer sandbox, where people or other developers can come, start playing with the components, start experiencing the components firsthand. And then we have a documentation. Documentation can be in form of a website, where we document everything related to design system, which, for example, component, how do you use a component, when to use that component, when not use that component, everything regarding the component or a pattern should be documented in a separate design system website. So these are the key components of our design system. Okay. So coming to the Digit design system, where we have developed a design system specifically for civic tech and GovTech products. I'll give a brief journey. How did we arrive to the design system? And why there was a need for building this design system? So a typical design process for any product is fairly straightforward, where we understand the primary user, and then everything we design or develop is modeled around that user. So this approach works clearly well when you know your primary audience or primary users. But when we started for, say, something like Digit or something in this domain, where we have a public utility platform, the diversity is too huge. I mean, you don't know, you are building your product can be used by someone who is sitting in Bangalore, or it can be used by someone who's sitting in a village in, say, Punjab. So you have to, the spectrum is huge for this. So how do you design for this complex diversity? So this problem is unique. And diversity is not just on the, say, the technology background. It's also can be on these factors. For example, there's a diversity across age and gender. There's diversity in poor and rich. There's a diversity in disabilities. So that's where the accessibility comes in. There's a diversity in language in specific country like India. There's a diversity in literacy and skills. There's a diversity in access to quality hardware and software. I mean, you cannot design things keeping in mind that somebody will be using the product in a very high bandwidth, say in a city, in urban, like a city like Bangalore, where you get like 100 Mbps, where you know that your product will also be used in a village where you don't get that speed. You have to design for that scenario also. So when you design for the low spectrum of the people, you automatically design for the higher spectrum for the people. So you always have to keep in mind. So when I say design, it's not just the visual design. It's also like, say, for example, when designing an API, your API, how much time it's taking. So those also adds to the overall user experience. Okay, so I just for a comparison, when you are building for a user, for a targeted set of user, you can see on the left, that's usually looks something like this. Your user base is uniform. You know that, for example, when you are, say, building a GovTech or a government product in a, say, country like Singapore, you know that your user base is slightly uniform. They're all sort of educated, they know English. But when you are designing for something like, say, country like India, where the diversity is huge, the image on the right makes more sense, where you don't know. It's like a rainforest. When you don't know, we have different types of trees growing around. So how do you design for this scenario? So for this, we need a different approach. For this, the traditional approach of identifying the key users, personas, and like designing everything around that persona is not going to work. We need a different approach for this this problem. So how do you achieve so we followed something called universal design, which we, in the design sense, we focus on three things: usability, accessibility, and inclusion. What basically means is you design for universal. So you design for both the spectrum. You design for the lower end of the spectrum. You design for the higher. It automatically designs for the higher spectrum. So you have to keep these three things in mind whenever you are designing for a universal design approach. It has to be usable, accessible, and inclusive. Okay, some examples what a universal design is. Some definition from W3C is like treating everyone the same and giving them equal opportunity, no matter what their abilities or circumstances. So this is the foundation for designing for a universal design. So it addresses a broad range of issues which I already covered. So it's accessible for people with disabilities, accessible to quality of hardware and software, computer literacy and skills, economic situation, education. All these things are kept in mind when design for a universal set of people. That's the core fundamental of universal design. Okay, so this gives we are on the end of the phase one, where I just talked about the design system in brief. Now we are going to go through the digital design system in detail. Okay. So we already have put the design system file and the design system documentation live. It's design.digit.org. So where we have documented everything, say from foundation to components, content, patterns, and resources. I will come on each of it now. Okay, so digital design system is basically divided into these six sections. Let me go through the brand first. So basically in brand, we talk about what are design principles or what are the objectives. So our digital design system is following certain principles. The first is user-centric. Everything you design should be revolved around the user. Second is usable, accessible, So these are the objectives for our digital design system. We have already also covered a bit on branding. So when you are building a product for your end customers, how do you use branding? If the state or municipal has a branding, how do you use it? And if they doesn't have a brand, how do you use in that scenario? So both the scenarios are here. Okay, let me come to the foundation part. Okay, so design system foundations. Every design system has typically foundation elements. For example, say colors. So we have defined across the product what are the colors which we'll be using, what are the color palettes is there, it's all defined, and each color has some context. For example, the primary color, if you see across digital product, is this orange color, but it has a context. If you see, it's the primary color used for buttons, links, anything which is like interactive elements, you use these colors. Similarly, all the colors are defined in context. For example, if you are using a side nav or a header, this is the color defined for it. We are using a divider or a card or a say text. These colors are defined in context for that. I will come to these things when I will talk about the customization. But for now, let's have a brief thing on colors. Okay, and all these colors are accessible colors according to WCAG guidelines. Coming to typography. So in Digit, we have followed two type fonts, Roboto and Roboto contents across everything. And again, here it's all defined in context. For example, which fonts to use for heading, what will the font weight, size. And for two scenarios, mobile, how we should use the fonts, and for desktop, how you should use the fonts. So there's a visual or font hierarchy, which is presented here, starting from the lowest set of fonts to the highest set of fonts, how you should be using it. The links for the Roboto contents and Roboto fonts are here in the website. And there are certain do's and don'ts of using the fonts. Example, when to use the headings, what to follow, what not to follow, when to use all caps, when to not use, how to use the links. So there are certain guidelines which you should go through when you are using fonts. Then we come to iconography. So iconography, we have a vast set of iconography, which is fairly borrowed from the very useful Google icon library. It's an open source library, which caters to all fonts. So it's a comprehensive set of icons, which it's keeping in mind that the products can be extended. In future, if you are building new products, we assume that you will get all the icons from here. If not, then we can create custom icons also. Okay, coming to accessibility. So accessibility, I touched a bit on the slides, but I will now go a little bit into detail. So accessibility is a key principle for any design system. Okay, I will just first of all go through the Indian government accessibility guidelines. So the link is here in the website itself. If you click on the link, so there are certain guidelines which is like mandated by Indian government to be followed for if you are designing any web application or website. So this is the guidelines. I'll just quickly go to this last checklist because given the time, just to give an overall sense of what to use and what not to use. Yeah. So if you come to the last section, which is the mobile app, say compliance. So you can see like, these are the checks. There are n number of rules, but these are the bare minimum we should have when you're designing anything in the Indian government space. The universal accessibility checklists are more stricter, but at least we should adhere to the Indian government. So all these accessibility checks we have tried to adhere in the digital design system. We have made sure that these are there. Okay, coming back. And also we have put a link for the overall accessibility, which is the defined by the W3C. The link is there. It's quite comprehensive, so you can go through it. But basically, Indian government is a subset of this. Okay, so that keeping these in mind, there are certain do's and don'ts which you have tried to give for you. For example, say use consistent heading hierarchy, use H1, H2, H3, H4s. Don't use something which is not in order. Make sure that something which you're doubling screen is always keyboard friendly. The tab should work properly. The focus should work properly. There has to be tooltip for everything, for every icon, for every menu. How do you use language? How do you use labels? There should be consistent label across your UIs. So we have figured out few do's and don'ts for you, which to follow in the product, with some examples we have given. So whenever using an image or video, just make sure that the area is also there for that. We have the alternate text for images. When you're using colors, make sure that the colors contrast is as per the W3C standards. For example, the image on the right will not pass the W3C compliance check, because if you see the contrast is not maintained here. Yeah, so always keep these two links handy. The one is the first one is the Indian government guidelines, and the second one is the more generic, the W3C guidelines. So coming to components now. So components are like the building blocks for the UI. So everything you see on the screen are built of these, combining these components together. So we have clearly categorized these components at a very atomic level and digit. So we can just have a look. So it's, for example, say header. A header in the app is defined so that every time you use a new module or product, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can use the same header. Of course, it can be customized. You can replace labels. You can put more icons, but the base remains the same. Similarly for buttons. And if you will see all these components in the design system, we also have a documentation, a clear set of guidelines around these components, like when to use these components, when not to use these components, what are the do's and don'ts. For example, say button, a button can have a different type of buttons. It can be a primary button, secondary button. It can be a button with multiple actions. So how do you use that? It can be a disabled. How do you group buttons? We check boxes. Date input. Okay, so they are fairly, we have tried to have all the basic components, but if you think that these components, you need some extra components, we are free to add components, but before using or adding a new component, just make sure that the component is not there. If the component is there, try to use the component. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. So that's the whole point of a design system. You should not have like inconsistency. The component should be uniform. Should not be any duplicacy in the components. Also coming to now the content. So content is basically your UI copy. Make sure that you have a emphatic tone. Your text should be, the tone should be enabling. It should be purposeful. Be concise in your thing. So for example, say error messages, make sure that you are following, if you are having some guidelines, stick to that. Keep a uniform tone. It goes for all the say inline content, the labels, the text, the feedback in form of those notifications. It's basically the UI copy. Okay, now I'll touch up on patterns. Patterns are a very important part of design system. So what I mean by pattern is, I will give you an example. For example, we are in a trade license, say, application, and we have a fairly straightforward application where a citizen is applying for a trade license. Now, if you see this trade license application form, you will start realizing that there is a pattern to it. So we start collecting information one by one. We have info steppers on the top. We have a button, and we keep collecting information. And finally, we give a user the summary, and then the application submitted. Now, if you go to any other module, say water and sewage, you will be finding a similar pattern. So that's how you abstract patterns. Okay, now coming back to design. So having seen all these things, we try to abstract certain patterns. For example, a language selection is abstracted, and it can now be used across modules, whether you're using a TL or ET or some other product itself. The language selection is defined. We don't have to recreate it. Once it's coded, it can be used for any number of applications. Similarly, we can go for a city selection. A city selection is a defined pattern in digit. For example, mobile verification is a 3-step process. You give mobile number, you receive OTP, and you enter OTP. So this is a pattern for mobile verification. Similarly, documents required whenever there's a new application form. Before the starting of the application, we upfront tell the citizen or the users to what documents are needed, so they don't have to figure it out later. So this is the pattern is defined here. How do you capture address is also defined. So by using the consistent pattern, how it will help is, it will help the end users to become familiar with the pattern across modules, and this gives a sense of trust that he's using, he or she using the trust a consistent pattern. Similarly, document upload is a common pattern across modules. We have application summary. Then let's come back to feedback. So every time citizen avails a certain service or application, we ask for the feedback. This again is common pattern. If you see the components, these things are configurable. So this is the options can be configurable. It can come from MDMS or a configurable file, but the pattern remains the same. Similarly, for these are all for the citizen side. Coming to the employee side, again, the login is a pattern for us. The employee landing page is a pattern for us, where employee can see all the modules he or she is having access to. Now, if you come to a certain inbox, for example, this is an inbox for an employee in a water department, but this will not change. The pattern remains the same if he's an employee for a trade license or a sewage department. It's the same inbox. Only thing which will change is maybe the columns, the filters, but the pattern remains the same. If you have any questions, please keep it. We'll come to the questions later once I finish. Okay, share in chat. 1 second. Let me see the questions. Okay, there are certain questions which are development centric. I'll come to that. We will probably have a developer seminar after this. Okay, coming to the patterns, we have the search. The search across application from employee is fairly straightforward defined. Every time, every module need not have a different search screen. So this is for example, a search a water application. It can be search trade application, search fire application, anything. Payment collection from an employee at a counter is also defined. How do you collect payment from a citizen? Then we have a counter form for employees. If you see the application form for employees and citizens are fairly different. Citizen was a more handhold step-based approach, while for employees who is filling this application on behalf of citizen, it's a straightforward, because it's for designed for speed, where he or she can quickly, with use of keyboard, can quickly fill the form. So this is where the accessibility pitch comes in, where you have to make this form like keyboard friendly, tab friendly. Now coming to the last part, which are the reports. Reports in modules are also pretty much defined. Then we have the dashboard, the final thing. So we have also defined the dashboards. Dashboard structure pattern remains the same. Only thing changes is the data, the values. But more or less, we have defined everything, the charts and all, so that it can be reused. Okay, so we have resources tabs also in the design system. So resource is the one is the GitHub, which will take you to the GitHub repo. And the other one is the Figma file, which we are currently working on. So we are in process of cleaning the Figma file and we'll put it once it's done. This is basically for designers who can start building on top of it, the screens. And the GitHub code repository is already up. So you can start taking the code from here, start building components. So we'll have a separate seminar, which will be more developer centric, how to use the coded components, how do you contribute to it. Okay, now coming to the last part, which is the customization of digital system and how do you build on top of it. So I will cover a few aspects. For example, when you are trying to customize design systems, so one of the key things which we have noticed is people changing few foundation level things. For example, colors, fonts, icons. So there are certain do's and don'ts you should keep in mind when you are changing it. For example, if you go to the color section, we have clearly defined the say our colors in context. For example, if you change this primary, then you should change this primary across for all the actionable items, keeping in mind the contrast. By contrast, what I mean is you can't use red on a green, which will fail the contrast checker. So we have also put a link for the contrast checker too. So every time you change color, just make sure you have this contrast level maintained. For example, if I say if my foreground color is blue and if I put you can see that certain things will fail at certain levels. See here, everything fails because the contrast is too much, or it's not readable. Okay, just a quick demo of. So if you see here, this is basically certain component which I have laid out in Figma. And if you're changing, say, the primary color, if you see this is the primary color which you're using, and you see this color is used across components in the design system. And if you decide to change this primary color to say as per the other brand or your end customer brand, for example, if I'm going here and say changing this primary color, say from orange to say blue. So let's take a good blue. Yeah, if you see this change will reflect across all the components. This should reflect across all the components, ideally, if you do it in code also. So if you in your code structure also, this should be a color variable defined at a global level, where you can change things at a global level. It should affect across things, keeping in mind the contrast and all. Let's revert it back. Okay, few other things, guidelines for typography. So when you if you have to change, say, font, you can change the font family. So if you see I have put we have put the link for the Roboto and Roboto Condensed. You can choose anything from an open font library, but make sure that you follow the font hierarchy, as in the size hierarchy that should be maintained, following all these do's and don'ts, which is mentioned here. Same thing with iconography. You are free to use any open source icon library. But we have used Google because we think that it's very comprehensive and think should serve all the needs. Apart from that, these foundation level changes, if you are changing anything in, say, components, make sure that this really is really required. Otherwise, don't change anything in the component, because we have made sure that the components are very bare minimum. It's all checked across browsers, cross-checked. If you feel the need of adding a new component, you are free to do so. But again, check from the existing set of components whether you are getting similar components or not before adding a new component. And if you add a new component, do check in back to the main eGov core library so that it can be extended. Yeah, I think that's it. If you have any questions, we are open to questions now. You can add questions in Q&A, or you can. So there's a question from, do we need to deploy REST services, or services are already deployed, which is ready to be consumed? I think these things are deployed. The link is there in the website. The next thing which we are planning is to have a community engagement around it. We will have a dedicated space for that. We will have forums where you can connect with digital code developers and designers and can exchange things. If you have any doubts, we can put on that forum. If you have any developer centric questions, so you can ask. I'll try to answer that also. The website, I'll put in the link for you to access this website. Yeah, if there are no further questions, I think we can wrap up. So we'll be sending you a feedback link. Okay, so there'll be a next webinar planned for which will be more developer. Okay, we have can we access digit code base to build system for government? Yes, I mean the link is there in the website. Go through. It's in the resources section, the GitHub section. Also, we will be having a further next set of webinar, which is more developer centric, where the developers can walk you through the. Yeah, so from the library perspective, are these components created as plain JavaScript? So these are available in two frameworks. One is React, and the other is we are building a Flutter component for that. So these are available in React and Flutter. Can we use digit code base to build systems for government? Of course, yes. So can you give a summary or database structure used? I think it's more developers question. So I'll pass it on to developers. So next webinar, you can get this answered. So yeah. So also there are certain, if you go to the GitHub code, there are also certain reference applications which we have built using this design system. So it will be good to go through those applications, see how exactly how the design system is used. I think yeah, we can wrap it now. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining the webinar. We'll keep you posted for the next set of webinars on the developer-centric design system use. Thank you all.